Kepler Vance stumbled over the craggy steps of the monastery, cursing every deity he could think of and a few he just invented for the occasion. His boots squelched with the persistent sludge of intergalactic travel, a muck that somehow managed to cling like an unwanted relative at a family reunion. "Monks and mud," he grumbled, slapping at his knees. Who knew they'd go together like whiskey and regret? The serene isolation of the monastery perched on the edge of planet nowhere might have seemed like a good idea to some. Not to Kepler. He was here because someone higher up the food chain had a sense of humor. A twisted, sadistic sense of humor, but humor nonetheless. As he reached the top of the stairs, a bald man in robes greeted him with a nod. "Kepler Vance, I presume," the monk said, as if Kepler were some sort of celebrity and not just a disgruntled space jockey. "Abbot Loxley, I presume," Kepler shot back, eyeing the monk's sandals. "You guys ever heard of shoes around here, or are you just trying to cultivate calluses that could stop a laser blast?" Loxley chuckled, the kind of laugh that suggested he might have heard every snarky comment under the twin suns. "Welcome to our humble sanctuary. We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival." "Bet you have," Kepler muttered, glancing around. The place looked like an IKEA catalog had vomited serenity all over a rock. The walls hummed with a sort of tranquility that could get on your nerves if you weren't the meditative type, which Kepler decidedly wasn't. He followed Loxley through the corridors, the scent of incense mixing with the metallic tang of recycled air. "So what's a nice monastery like this doing in a galaxy like ours? Safeguarding humanity's future," Loxley said, as if that explained everything. Kepler snorted. "Right, you and your merry band of bald pals saving us from the universe's big bad wolf. I've seen this movie and spoiler alert, it doesn't end well." Loxley smiled, a serene expression that made Kepler want to punch something. Just a little. "We believe in preparing for the inevitable challenges. The heat death of the universe, for instance." "Heat death," Kepler echoed, derisive skepticism dripping from his words. "I thought it was a couple trillion years away. We're talking planning ahead. Like, really ahead." "It's never too early to prepare," Loxley said, leading Kepler into a chamber that was decidedly less serene than the rest. Banks of monitors blinked and beeped, and the hum of machinery had a threatening edge. "Ah, I see," Kepler said, eyeing the setup. "You've got a secret lab because of course you do. Nothing says monastic life like dubious science experiments." Loxley paused, looking contemplative. "We call it a sanctuary for creation." Kepler raised an eyebrow. "Sanctuary? You mean like Frankenstein's lab, but with more chanting and less angry mobs?" "More or less," Loxley agreed, with a chuckle. The humor in his eyes didn't quite reach his lips, which made Kepler think maybe Loxley wasn't all serenity and sandal leather after all. They passed a row of tanks filled with something that looked suspiciously like amniotic fluid, and Kepler's stomach did an uncomfortable flip. "Cloning. That's your big save-the-universe plan," Loxley nodded, as if making clones in a forgotten corner of the galaxy was as normal as brewing a cup of tea. "We clone to preserve humanity, each one a potential future," Kepler snorted. "Yeah, until they start eating each other, or us," Loxley shrugged. "Risk is inherent in all ventures." "You came here, did you not?" "Touché," Kepler admitted, remembering the laughably optimistic mission briefing. Something about exploration and intergalactic goodwill. Nobody mentioned cloning vats or monks with thousand-yard stares. "You should meet some of our successes," Loxley suggested, with an air of a man leading a horse to water, unaware that the horse was fond of an occasional whiskey instead. Kepler followed Loxley to a spacious room where about a dozen identical young men were doing yoga, or whatever passed for yoga when flexibility wasn't in the cards. "Ah," Kepler said, "so you've got a choir." "They are prototypes," Loxley said, less defensively than anyone else might have in the same situation. "Perfect replicas engineered for endurance." "Lot of good endurance does when the universe goes kaput," Kepler pointed out. "What about personality, or is that just an afterthought?" Loxley shrugged, a motion that seemed to say, "What can you do? We are still working out the finer details." Kepler peered at one of the clones, whose face was a mask of bored serenity. They've got the monk expression down, I'll give him that. Ever think about teaching them sarcasm? A lesson best learned through experience, Loxley replied, with a glance that suggested he'd had his share of sarcastic experiences. Kepler moved closer to one of the yoga enthusiasts, wary of any sudden enlightenment. So, what's your endgame, Loxley? Loxley leaned against a control panel, his gaze distant. We're playing the long game, Kepler. When the universe starts to wind down, we'll have the means to continue in some form. And how's that working out for you so far? Kepler asked, arms crossed, skepticism hanging in the air like the stench of burnt offerings. We've made progress, Loxley said, his tone more hopeful than confident. Kepler considered the cloned yogas. I'd say you've got a ways to go before you hit savior of humanity status. But hey, I'm just the wildly skeptical bystander. As they spoke, one of the clones stood up abruptly, eyes wide with something that looked suspiciously like panic. Not this again, Kepler muttered, moving instinctively as the clone stumbled forward, babbling incoherently. Loxley sighed as if this were all part of the usual routine. They occasionally experience moments of existential crisis. Crisis of existence, huh? Kepler quipped, catching the clone before it could faceplant. Join the club, buddy. The clone blinked up at him, bewildered. What? What am I? A question for the ages, Kepler said, patting the clone on the head. You're a walking, talking insurance policy, apparently. Loxley ushered the clone back to the group with gentle insistence. They need time to adjust, he explained, as though this was the simplest thing in the universe. Kepler shook his head, wondering what sort of madness he'd signed up for. You sure you know what you're doing, Loxley? Rarely, Loxley admitted, scratching his bald head. But we're doing something. Kepler turned, intending to head back the way they'd come, but paused. You ever think maybe you're playing God? Loxley laughed quietly, a sound more akin to a sigh. Isn't that what we all do in our own small ways? Yeah, but some of us just make bad jokes. Ah, but jokes are a kind of creation too, Loxley countered, smiling. And sometimes they save us. Kepler rolled his eyes. Well, here's hoping your punchline doesn't involve the end of the universe. Loxley chuckled softly, leading the way back to the entrance. I suppose we'll find out. Their steps echoed in the corridor, the silence between them less awkward, more accepting of the strange reality they'd found themselves in. Kepler couldn't tell if the universe was laughing with them or at them. Probably both. As they reached the entrance, Kepler paused. So how much do I tell HQ? Tell them what you like, Loxley said, shrugging. I'm sure they'll appreciate the irony. Kepler grinned, an expression that felt like a grimace. They always do. With a final nod, he turned and walked down the steps, feeling the eyes of the clones on his back, the wary gaze of a people who weren't quite people yet. He paused mid-step, a thought striking him. Loxley, he called back, you ever think what happens if they don't want to preserve humanity? Loxley tilted his head, considering. We can only guide them so far. Right, Kepler said, raising a hand in farewell. Good luck with the guiding. As he clomped down the last few steps, Kepler couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed the beginning of something profound or profoundly stupid. Either way, it was out of his hands. And as for the heat death of the universe, well, he'd file that under problems for future Kepler. Kepler Vance had never been particularly good at keeping his mouth shut, and right now that talent, or lack thereof, had landed him on a planet charmingly dubbed Nowhere. As he trudged away from the monastery, he couldn't help but wonder if this whole mission was just another cosmic joke at his expense. A joke with the punchline being the possible end of humanity. Hilarious stuff. The universe was falling apart, or it would, eventually. The colonies were in disarray, scattered like a toddler's puzzle across the galaxy, and the monastery's cloning experiment seemed to be the last, desperate roll of the dice. The idea that a bunch of bald guys in robes might hold humanity's future in their sandal-clad hands was almost enough to make him laugh. Almost. Kepler's ship, the Rust Bucket, because why tempt fate with a name like Starlancer or Destiny, right? stood waiting at the edge of the clearing, looking as rundown as he felt. The paint was peeling, the hull was dented, and the engine purred like a dying cat. But it flew, and that was all that mattered. As he sidled up to the ship, a voice crackled to life on his comms. "Vance, you getting your zen on with the monks?" It was Commander Drexler, his voice dripping with the kind of authority that came with a complete lack of field experience and a surplus of smugness. Kepler resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Zen, sure, let's go with that. You sending me to any more peaceful retreats, or is this the last one? Don't get too comfortable. We need intel. The colonies are crumbling faster than my mother's apple pie after a week in cryo. Your mom's cooking aside, I'm not sure cloning a bunch of emotionless drones is the solution to the whole heat-death thing." "Look, Vance," Drexler said, his voice dropping to that low, conspiratorial tone that always meant bad news. "Earth's hanging by a thread. If Loxley's merry band can pull this off, it might be our only shot." Kepler leaned against the rustbucket's hull, staring back at the monastery. A bunch of robed ascetics, tinkering away at humanity's salvation with all the urgency of a Sunday picnic. "Fine. I'll play nice. But if they start chanting about the end times, I'm out." Drexler's laugh was humorless. "Just get us something we can use, Vance. We're counting on you." Yeah, Kepler muttered, cutting the connection before Drexler could come up with any more motivational speeches. He tapped a few buttons on the console to open the ship's ramp, then paused, glancing back toward the monastery. He should leave. He had the information he needed. The abbot's plan was risky, sure, but who was he to judge? After all, he wasn't exactly the poster child for responsible decision-making. But curiosity was a persistent itch under his skin, the kind that wouldn't be satisfied until it had been thoroughly scratched. Kepler sighed, turning back toward the monastery with the reluctant determination of a man about to walk into an intergalactic bar with his tab unpaid. Inside, Loxley was leading a group of monks in a chant that was half tranquility, half snore-inducing. Kepler waited for a pause in the droning before clearing his throat. "Loxley, got a minute?" The abbot turned, his expression as tranquil as ever. "Kepler, back so soon? I thought you'd be itching to leave." "I was, but I had this weird urge to watch humanity try and save itself with the power of meditation and test tubes." "Care to show me more?" Loxley's eyes twinkled with a kind of amusement that made Kepler squirm. "Of course. Right this way." They wound through the corridors again, past the chanting rooms and the meditation alcoves, until they reached another chamber lined with more of those tanks. Each one held a clone, floating serenely in a nutrient bath, looking for all the world like a collection of oversized babies waiting to be delivered to some galactic nursery. "So, this is it. The big plan?" Kepler asked, tapping on the glass of one tank. "Hope they don't come out thinking they're fish. Each one is a blank slate, ready to absorb the knowledge and skills we pass on to them," Loxley explained, sounding for all the world like a proud parent showing off a science fair project. "And what if they don't want to be your little saviors? What if they decide they'd rather take up knitting and live in a yurt on Mars? Their choices are their own," Loxley replied, with the patience of a man who'd spent years in introspection. "We provide the means for them to inherit the universe, but their paths are not ours to dictate." Kepler snorted. "Really? You ever seen a kid left alone with a box of matches? I'm betting they'd burn the house down before you could say free will." "We guide them, but we do not control them," Loxley said, his gaze steady. "It's a balance." "A balance," Kepler echoed, looking around at the rows of identical faces. "Seems like a lot of eggs in one basket." Loxley smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of the lips. "The alternative is doing nothing." Kepler considered that, weighing it against the burning ruin of what used to be cohesive Earth colonies. "Guess that's fair," he admitted reluctantly. "But you've got to know this could all go sideways. Every plan carries risk." "Risk? This is a Hail Mary wrapped in a lottery ticket." Kepler shook his head, marveling at the sheer audacity. "Why's everyone so sure this is going to work?" What's your backup plan if it doesn't? Loxley's expression didn't change, but there was a hint of steel in his voice. We adapt. Humanity adapts. It's why we've survived this long. Adapting's fine and dandy when you're dealing with evolving climates or pandemics. Not sure how it holds up against entropy. Entropy is relentless, but so is hope. Kepler rolled his eyes. Hope's great, but last I checked, it doesn't power spaceships or keep gravity in place. Loxley chuckled softly, the sound almost drowned out by the mechanical hum of the tanks. You're a cynic, Kepler, I understand. I used to be one myself. Yeah, what happened? You get hit over the head with a revelation or just decided life's easier when you're wearing rose-colored glasses? Neither. I found purpose. Loxley gestured to the clones. These are more than just cells and tissue, they're potential. And in a universe winding down, potential is our greatest asset. Kepler wanted to argue, to point out the flaws, the unknowns, the sheer insanity of placing all hopes on a bunch of engineered humans. But the truth was, he didn't have a better idea, and maybe that scared him more than anything. He looked at Loxley, really looked at him, trying to see past the calm exterior. Why you doing this, Loxley? What's in it for you? For me? Nothing. For humanity, everything. Big words for a bald guy in a robe, Kepler said, trying to mask his unease with humor. But I guess you've got balls, I'll give you that. Loxley laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room. Courage comes in many forms, Kepler. So does faith. Kepler shook his head, trying to wrap his mind around the idea. Faith's all well and good, but you're going to need more than that. You're going to need. But before he could finish, a loud klaxon blared through the chamber, cutting him off. The sound reverberated off the walls, a shrill, urgent wail that instantly set Kepler's nerves on edge. What now? He demanded, instinctively reaching for the sidearm he'd strapped to his belt. That the we're all screwed alarm. Loxley's face was a mask of calm, though there was a tightness around his eyes. It's an alert. Something's wrong with one of the vats. Kepler followed Loxley as he sprinted down the line of tanks, the chaos a stark contrast to the earlier serenity. Monks were rushing about, their robes flapping as they hurried to address the crisis. Which one? Kepler shouted over the din, scanning the tanks for any sign of trouble. There. Loxley pointed to a tank at the far end, where the liquid inside was bubbling ominously. The clone within was thrashing violently, eyes wide with terror, fingers clawing at the glass in frantic desperation. Kepler's stomach did a somersault at the sight, a visceral reminder that these were living beings, not just science projects. Can you shut it down? Kepler asked, urgency twisting his voice into a sharp knife. We need to stabilize the system, or... But Loxley didn't get to finish. The tank shattered with a deafening crash, shards of glass scattering across the floor in a sparkling, deadly spray. Kepler ducked instinctively, shielding his face as the clone spilled out, gasping and flailing on the floor. It looked around wildly, eyes darting from face to face with a mixture of confusion and fear. Help him, Loxley ordered, quickly moving to the clone's side. Kepler didn't need to be told twice. He was already on his knees, grabbing the clone by the shoulders, trying to still the frantic motions. Hey, it's okay. You're okay. The clone's eyes locked onto his, something flickering in their depths, an understanding perhaps, or a plea for reassurance. What happened? It croaked, voice raw and unsteady. Welcome to the universe, kid, Kepler said, trying for a reassuring smile that felt more like a grimace. You're part of a grand experiment to save humanity. No pressure. The clone blinked, the terror slowly fading to resignation. Great, just great. Trust me, Kepler muttered, glancing at Loxley, who was already instructing a team to clean up the mess. It's not as bad as it seems. Well, maybe it is, but at least you're not alone. The clone stared at him, a ghost of a smile playing on its lips. Could be worse. Could be dead. True, Kepler agreed, hauling the clone to its feet. Now let's get you sorted before you end up breaking something else. Loxley approached, his expression one of quiet determination. This is a setback, but not insurmountable. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Kepler nodded, even as doubt nagged at him. You sure this is gonna work, Loxley? Saving humanity with clones and hope. It's a start, Loxley said, clapping a hand on Kepler's shoulder. And sometimes a start is all you need. Kepler took a deep breath, nodding. All right, but I'm keeping my exit strategy handy, just in case. Loxley gave him a knowing look. Wise choice, but you might find it harder to leave than you think. Kepler chuckled darkly, leading the clone toward the other monks. We'll see about that. As the chaos settled and the monks resumed their work, Kepler lingered by the tanks, watching them quietly. Maybe this crazy plan would work. Maybe it wouldn't. But either way, he'd be damned if he wasn't going to stick around and find out. Because at the end of the universe, or the beginning of a new one, curiosity was the one thing that had kept humanity going. And if nothing else, Kepler Vance was curious as hell. Kepler had barely finished hauling the soaked clone to its feet when the intercom crackled to life, spewing out static and the unmistakable voice of Commander Drexler. "Vance, report." "Busy here, Commander," Kepler replied, irritation laced in his tone. "Just another day in the clone nursery. How's your paperwork going?" "Cut the sarcasm, Vance." "We've got a situation." Kepler rolled his eyes, earning a curious glance from the newly birthed clone. "Of course we do. We always do. What is it this time? Did someone forget to water the plants or misplace the universe's last hope? The environmental controls are failing," Drexler continued, ignoring Kepler's jibes. "The storm outside is wreaking havoc on the systems. We need a fix and fast." "Great," Kepler muttered, looking at Loxley. "You hear that? The weather's turned hostile. Must have heard there's hope brewing here and decided to crash the party." Loxley's calm exterior was beginning to show cracks, a furrow forming between his brows. "The storms on nowhere are unpredictable. We'll need to stabilize the environmental controls before they compromise the tanks." "No pressure, huh?" Kepler said, shaking his head. "Guess I better go play mechanic before we end up with a bunch of overcooked clones." Loxley gestured towards a panel on the wall, ancient and worn, much like the rest of the monastery. "The main control room is just down the hall. You'll find the interface there." Kepler turned to the clone, who was still looking around like a startled deer. "You okay to stand here and not break anything else, or you want to join the fun?" The clone blinked, as if processing the option of staying put or diving into more chaos. I'll stay." "Smart choice," Kepler said, patting the clone on the shoulder before turning to Loxley. "Watch over him. I've got a date with some faulty wiring." As Kepler trudged down the corridor, the dim lights flickering like they'd lost the will to illuminate, he pondered the irony. Here he was, trying to save a planet ironically named Nowhere, where every piece of tech seemed to be on the brink of a meltdown. If that wasn't a metaphor for his life, he didn't know what was. The control room was a mess of tangled wires, flickering screens, and more blinking lights than a Christmas tree on its last legs. Kepler approached the main console, which looked like it had been cobbled together from a dozen different eras of technology. He'd seen more up-to-date equipment on his rust bucket, which was saying something. "All right, you old piece of junk," he muttered to the console, his fingers dancing over the buttons with the familiarity of someone who'd spent too much time fixing things held together by spit and a prayer. "Let's see what's wrong." The screens displayed a chaotic jumble of data, none of which made sense at first glance. Not that it mattered. Kepler had learned long ago that most technology didn't need to make sense. It just needed to be kicked until it worked. "Vance," Commander Drexler's voice crackled in again, a bit more urgent this time. "Status update." "Working on it," Kepler replied, tapping on the screen with the practiced nonchalance of someone who'd been in tighter spots. "Looks like the storm's messing with the external sensors. I'll try recalibrating them." "Recalibrating? You sure you can handle that?" Kepler snorted. "Commander, if I can handle your daily briefings without jumping out an airlock, I can handle this." Drexler's response was a low growl, but Kepler could imagine the man's thin patience stretching even thinner. Good, he thought. Misery loves company. The storm outside howled, the sound echoing through the corridors like a banshee's wail. Kepler blocked it out, focusing on the task at hand. He tweaked a few settings, rerouted some power through a backup system, and for good measure gave the console a solid whack on the side. The lights flickered again, Steadier this time, and the screens cleared, the garbled mess of data resolving into something intelligible. "There we go," Kepler said, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Take that, Mother Nature." Back in the cloning chamber, Loxley was directing the monks to secure the tanks, ensuring that the clones wouldn't be turned into a science experiment gone wrong. Kepler reappeared, wiping his hands on his jacket, the grease leaving streaks on the worn fabric. "All sorted," he announced, earning a round of relieved sighs from the monks. "Systems are stabilized for now." "But I wouldn't bet on them holding forever," Loxley nodded, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "You've bought us time, and that's no small feat." "Time's great," Kepler said, glancing at the rows of tanks, "but if these storms keep up, you'll need more than a quick fix. You'll need a miracle." "Miracles are in short supply," Loxley agreed. "But ingenuity is not. Well, if you've got any spare genius lying around, now's a good time to dust it off." Kepler turned to the clone, who seemed to have found some measure of calm. "You holding up, kid?" The clone shrugged, a gesture that seemed oddly human for someone who'd been breathing air for less than an hour. "It's a lot to take in." "Welcome to the club," Kepler said. "We're all just trying to keep our heads above water." Loxley approached, his gaze steady on the clone. "You have a choice now. You can stay and learn, or you can leave and find your own path." The clone looked between them, uncertainty etched into its features. "And if I choose wrong?" Kepler chuckled dryly. "Join the club. We're all experts at screwing up." "You'll find your way," Loxley assured the clone, his voice steady. "We all do." Kepler watched the monks return to their tasks, their murmured conversations a background hum. Despite the chaos, there was a strange sort of peace in the air, a determination to continue, even when the universe seemed hell-bent on throwing a wrench into the works. "So, what now?" Kepler asked, crossing his arms and leaning against the wall. "You think these kids are gonna be our salvation?" "It's not just about salvation," Loxley said, gesturing to the tanks. "It's about potential. Each of them represents a new possibility." Kepler snorted. "Yeah, well, I hope they're better at fixing things than the current stock. No offense." "None taken," Loxley replied with a small smile. "It's about growth, not perfection." "Perfection's overrated," Kepler agreed. "But if you ask me, you should add problem-solving to the curriculum. We could use a few more people who know how to tinker without blowing things up." "We're working on it," Loxley said, casting a glance at the clone, who was now deep in conversation with another monk. "In the meantime, we'll keep doing what we can." "Guess that's all any of us can do," Kepler said, pushing away from the wall. "Keep on keeping on, even when the universe seems determined to fall apart around us." Loxley nodded, his expression one of quiet resolve. "That's the spirit." Kepler gave him a long look, surprised to realize that he actually admired the man's steadfastness. In a world where everything and everyone seemed to be losing their ever-loving minds, it was nice to know that there were still people willing to hold the line. "All right," Kepler said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get back to it. No rest for the wicked, right?" Loxley laughed softly, the sound a bomb against the storm outside. Indeed. As Kepler moved to help the monks with their tasks, a thought struck him. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to this whole hope and potential business. Maybe it wasn't all just a load of cosmic crap. And as he worked alongside the monks, patching up what he could and offering sarcastic encouragement where he couldn't, he realized that, despite everything, he was glad he'd stayed. Because sometimes curiosity was enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, sticking around could lead to something good. Or, at the very least, something interesting. Kepler Vance stretched his back, feeling the satisfying crack of vertebrae realigning. Just another day of saving the human race from itself, one faulty wire at a time. He was just about to make another snarky comment about the state of the universe when the monastery's alarm system, which he thought had long given up the ghost, started blaring like a banshee on a bad day. "Well, that's new," Kepler said, glancing at Loxley, who looked like he'd just bitten into a particularly sour lemon. "The perimeter defenses," Loxley muttered, more to himself than anyone. "They've been triggered." "Fantastic," Kepler deadpanned. "What's next? Locusts, plague." A surprise musical number. Loxley ignored him, already moving toward the control panel that monitored the monastery's borders. Kepler followed, more out of curiosity than anything else. Maybe he could add fending off invasions to his resume. It'd definitely make for good cocktail party fodder, assuming he ever went to those types of parties. The screens flickered to life, showing grainy footage of figures moving through the storm. They were armed and organized, and judging by their miserable expressions, they definitely weren't here for afternoon tea. "Who the hell are they?" Kepler asked, squinting at the screen. "And do they know they've picked the worst vacation spot in the galaxy? Looks like Sable Thrace and her merry band of misfits," Loxley said, his voice tinged with both frustration and a hint of admiration. "They're one of the more ambitious colonist factions." "Ambitious, you say?" Kepler smirked. "They look like they'd have trouble organizing a picnic, let alone a coup." Loxley shot him a look. "Don't underestimate her. Thrace has a reputation for getting what she wants." "Yeah, so does my ex, but I wouldn't let her storm a monastery." As the ragtag group drew closer, Kepler could see their leader, a woman with a steely gaze that could melt duranium. Sable Thrace. The name suited her. She looked as if she could make the universe bend to her will through sheer force of personality. "Vance, you reading me?" Drexler's voice crackled over the intercom, his timing as impeccable as ever. "We've got hostiles approaching." "Yeah, Commander, I noticed. Got any bright ideas, or do we just point and laugh at their poor life choices?" "Thrace and her people believe they can do what we're doing here better," Drexler said, his tone grim. "They want control of the monastery." "Of course they do," Kepler sighed. "Can't anyone just send a polite email these days?" The intercom went silent, leaving Kepler with the lovely task of figuring out how to keep the potential invaders from ruining his day. He turned to Loxley, who was already barking orders to the monks, preparing for the worst. "So what's the plan?" Kepler asked, crossing his arms. "Prepare for the worst and hope we don't get a kick in the teeth." Loxley gave him a brief, tired smile. "Something like that." The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if it were lending its voice to the chaos about to unfold. Kepler watched as the monks set up makeshift barricades and armed themselves with whatever they could find, mostly tools and a few ancient-looking weapons that appeared more ceremonial than functional. If this ended up as a battle, it was likely to look more like a slap fight at a retirement home than an epic clash of titans. Kepler picked up a wrench, testing its weight. Not exactly a blaster, but it would do in a pinch. "Guess I'm a soldier now," he muttered. "Hope they've got a good dental plan." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a dull knife. As the storm's fury pounded against the monastery walls, it was hard not to feel the weight of impending confrontation. Kepler glanced at the clone, who was now nervously clutching a length of pipe like it was a lifeline. "Hey, kid," Kepler said, keeping his voice light. "First fight." The clone nodded, looking more like a lost child than a future savior of humanity. "I didn't think it'd be like this." "Welcome to adulthood," Kepler replied, clapping the clone on the shoulder. "It's mostly paperwork and disappointment." Before the clone could reply with what was sure to be a profound insight or at least a terrified grunt, the main doors shuddered as someone pounded on them from the outside. The sound was followed by Thrace's voice, muffled but unmistakably commanding. "Open up," she shouted. "We don't want to hurt anyone, but we will if we have to." Kepler exchanged a glance with Loxley. "Friendly lot, aren't they?" Loxley took a deep breath, then stepped forward, projecting his voice over the cacophony of the storm. "This monastery is under our protection, Thrace. We have no quarrel with you, but we won't hand it over either." "Your protection?" Thrace's voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "You can barely keep the lights on. We have a plan, Loxley, a real plan to save us all." Kepler rolled his eyes. "Great. Another savior complex. Just what we need." Loxley didn't flinch. "Plans are only as good as their execution, Thrace. And from where I'm standing, your execution looks a bit uncoordinated." There was a pause, and Kepler could almost hear Thrace weighing her options. It was one thing to plan a takeover, but another entirely to succeed without bloodshed, especially when your army looked like it had been cobbled together from the dregs of society. The doors shuddered again, this time more insistently. "Last chance, Locksley," Thrace called. "Open up or we come in." Kepler sighed, stepping up beside Locksley. "Looks like it's go time." "You ready for this?" The monk gave a small nod, his expression as calm as ever. "We do what we must." Kepler couldn't help but grin. "Right. Let's show them what a bunch of monks and a sarcastic mechanic can do." With a collective breath, they braced for whatever came next. As the doors buckled under another assault, Kepler couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be one hell of a story later. Assuming they survived, of course. The doors burst open with a crash and Thrace's people surged in, looking less like conquerors and more like a ragtag group of tourists who'd taken a wrong turn at the gift shop. Kepler swung his wrench, more for show than anything else, hoping the intimidation factor would work in their favor. "Welcome to the party," he shouted, ducking a wild swing from one of Thrace's goons. "Hope you brought snacks." The room erupted into chaos, a flurry of movement and noise that made Kepler's head spin. He dodged and weaved, swinging his wrench with reckless abandon. The clone, bless its naive heart, had taken up a defensive position alongside the monks, wielding its pipe like a sword. It was both comical and oddly heartwarming to see the kid trying so hard not to get pulverized. Thrace herself waded through the melee like a general surveying the battlefield, eyes narrowed as she looked for Locksley. The monk, for his part, was busy fending off two attackers with surprising agility, his calm demeanor never wavering. Kepler caught sight of Commander Drexler on a screen, watching the chaos unfold from the safety of wherever the hell he actually was. Must be nice, Kepler thought, not having to worry about getting your skull cracked open. "Vance," Drexler's voice barked over the speakers. "You need to contain this." "Contain this?" Kepler shouted back, narrowly avoiding a punch that would have left him seeing stars. "What do you think I am, a miracle worker? Just do your damn job." Kepler gritted his teeth, deciding that if he survived this, he might just have a chat with Drexler about the definition of support. But for now, survival was his main focus. He ducked under a swing, brought his wrench up to block another, and then lashed out with a kick that sent one of Thrace's men sprawling. "You know," Kepler said, panting slightly as he found himself back-to-back with Locksley, "I imagined this job would involve more sitting around and less impending doom." Locksley chuckled, dodging another attack. "Life rarely meets our expectations." "Yeah, but this is like expecting a relaxing vacation and getting dropped into a shark tank." "Stay focused," Locksley advised, his voice steady. Kepler grunted in response, focusing back on the task at hand, namely, not getting killed. Around him, the room was a maelstrom of bodies and chaos, the storm outside raging in sympathy. It was almost beautiful in a way, if you ignored the whole imminent death thing. As the battle continued, Kepler realized that the monks were holding their own better than he'd expected. Sure, they were outnumbered, but they fought with a determination that was almost inspiring. Almost. But then, as if the universe decided to add another layer to the clusterfuck cake, a loud crash resounded through the room. Kepler turned just in time to see one of the tanks, containing a half-formed clone, shatter. The liquid within spilled out, adding a slippery hazard to the already treacherous floor. "Well, that's just perfect," Kepler muttered, sidestepping the mess and hoping none of the other tanks decided to follow suit. The clone on the floor, a tiny, shivering thing, looked up at him with wide eyes. Kepler spared it a brief glance, silently apologizing for its terrible introduction to life, then turned back to the fight. He couldn't afford to worry about the clone right now. The living were enough of a handful. Thrace had finally managed to make her way to Locksley, the two facing off with a tension that crackled in the air. Kepler watched, ready to intervene if necessary, but also curious to see how this would play out. "Locksley," Thrace said, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Step aside. This place doesn't have to be your grave." "I could say the same to you," Locksley replied, his tone even. "We don't have to fight." "Oh, we do," Thrace countered, her eyes flashing. "Because you've got something we need." Kepler edged closer, ready to jump in if things got dicey. "We've got plenty of bad luck to go around if that's what you're after," he said, drawing Thrace's attention. She gave him a once-over, her expression both amused and slightly disdainful. "And you are, Kepler Vance," he replied, offering a mock salute. "Resident mechanic, part-time comedian." Thrace snorted, a ghost of a smile playing at her lips. "Cute, but this isn't your fight." "Yeah, well, I've got a vested interest in not dying today, so I'm gonna stay involved." The standoff was interrupted by another crash, this time the sound of machinery short-circuiting. Kepler swore under his breath. The storm was doing a number on the Monastery systems, and the last thing they needed was more failures. "Great," he muttered, as if things weren't exciting enough. "Vance," Drexler's voice barked over the speakers again. "Focus on keeping the systems running. We can't afford to lose the whole setup." Kepler rolled his eyes. "Sure thing, Commander. I'll just pause this little brawl and go fix all our problems with the power of optimism." But sarcasm wouldn't fix the issue, and Kepler knew it. With a resigned sigh, he turned from the fight, making his way back to the main console. He might not be a miracle worker, but he'd be damned if he didn't try to keep the lights on. As he worked, the battle continued around him, the monks and Thrace's people locked in a desperate struggle. Kepler shoved some wires back into place, rerouted power where he could, and prayed to whatever cosmic forces were listening that things wouldn't get worse. "Kepler," Loxley called out, his voice rising above the noise. "We need those systems now." "Working on it," Kepler shouted back, his hands moving faster than his brain could keep up with. "Just keep them off me for a few more minutes." Time seemed to blur as Kepler worked, the chaos of the battle fading into the background. All that mattered was keeping the systems online, ensuring that the Monastery wouldn't fall into darkness, or worse. Bit by bit, he managed to stabilize things. That in the midst of the chaos, Kepler Vance was discovering that desperation brought out the best and worst in people. Mostly the worst. Thrace's so-called army was a motley crew, looking like they'd been recruited from a particularly rough bar during Happy Ior, or Unhappy Ior, considering their current mood. The monks, on the other hand, fought like zealots with a higher purpose. That purpose being, apparently, not dying in a grim space monastery. Admirable, really. Kepler had never been much for prayer, but he found himself murmuring a quick request to whatever deity happened to be on duty. "Please don't let this end with me as a bloody smear on the floor." Amen. With the environmental controls finally stabilized, Kepler shoved the panel back into place, sending a spark of electricity through his hand that made him yelp. "Bloody circuits," he muttered, shaking his hand as if that would somehow calm the angry electrons. He turned back to the chaos, just in time to see Loxley duck under a wild swing from Thrace. The monk moved with a practiced ease, as if he'd been dodging would-be conquerors his whole life. Maybe he had. Kepler wouldn't put it past him. "Do you ever get tired of being the guy everyone wants to kill?" Kepler called out, picking up his wrench again. It felt reassuring in his hand, like the universe's most sarcastic security blanket. Loxley didn't even look up as he responded, his voice calm amid the storm. "It comes with the territory, part of the job description. Right, next to make enigmatic statements and wear robes in all the wrong weather." "Exactly." Kepler grinned despite himself. It was hard to keep a bad mood around Loxley. Or maybe it was just hard to stay focused on your mortality when you had someone else to banter with. Thrace, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. Kepler could see it in the way her movements were becoming sharper, more aggressive. She was a woman used to getting her way, and she clearly hadn't expected the monks to put up such a fight. "Give it up, Thrace," Loxley said, sidestepping another swing. "This isn't worth dying for." "It's worth everything," she snapped back, her eyes blazing. "You're just too blind to see it." "Yeah, well, blindness is a family trait," Kepler interjected, aiming a particularly vicious swing at one of her goons. "But thanks for the diagnosis, Doc." The sarcasm was lost on her, but it made Kepler feel slightly better. Small victories and all that. Then something shifted. A crackling hiss filled the air, and for a moment Kepler thought it was just the sound of his own sanity finally giving up and going home. But no, it was something else. Something worse. The cloning tanks were failing. Kepler turned toward the sound, eyes widening as he saw the delicate machinery starting to spark and smoke. The tanks, the ones he just managed to stabilize, were slowly shutting down, their lights flickering like candles in a storm. Perfect, Kepler muttered, because of course this was happening now. Just perfect. Drexler's voice crackled over the intercom, apparently oblivious to the ongoing chaos. Vance. What's going on with the tanks? Gee, Commander, maybe they're just as tired of this shit as I am, Kepler shot back, voice dripping with sarcasm. They're shorting out genius. Fix it. Kepler bit back a retort about Drexler's impressive grasp of the obvious and instead turned his attention back to the tanks. He could hear the faint hum of the systems trying to reboot, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The monks and Thrace's people continued their brawl, but now there was a new urgency in the air. Everyone understood what those tanks meant. They were humanity's last, desperate hope, assuming, of course, that birthing a new generation of humans in a decrepit monastery wasn't just a colossal waste of resources. Kepler took a deep breath, pushing aside the panic clawing at his throat. He wasn't a hero, barely even a competent mechanic some days, but he wasn't about to let everything go to hell if he could help it. "Keep them off me," he shouted to Loxley, diving back toward the control panel with renewed determination. "I've got a date with some malfunctioning tech." Loxley nodded, fending off another attacker with a calm that bordered on unnatural. Maybe it was a monk thing, Kepler thought. A stay cool while the universe burns kind of vibe. Must be nice. The console was a mess of blinking lights and angry beeps, none of which seemed inclined to cooperate. Kepler cursed under his breath, yanking wires and hoping that somewhere in the tangled mess there was a solution to their current problem. "Come on," he muttered, slapping the side of the console for good measure. "Work, damn you." The machine responded with a particularly loud sizzle, like an insult from beyond the grave. Kepler sighed. It was going to be one of those days, huh? Thrace seemed to sense the shift in the room, her gaze flicking to the failing tanks. "Loxley," she called out, voice ringing with authority. "Stop this madness. I've got the resources to fix them." "And yet here we are," Loxley replied, parrying another attack. "Breaking first, offering solutions later. It's a wonder you haven't solved the universe's problems yet." Kepler let out a bark of laughter despite himself, the sound harsh and slightly hysterical. At least if they died here, they'd go out with style. "Vance." Drexler's voice was a constant reminder of his least favorite person. "Status report." Kepler didn't bother to hold back his irritation. "Oh, you know, just wrestling with the apocalypse. How's your day going?" "Cut the crap and working on it," Kepler interrupted, pulling out a singed circuit board and shoving another into place. He watched the lights flicker, holding his breath as the system groaned in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the lights began to stabilize, the hum of the machinery evening out. It wasn't fixed, far from it, but at least it wasn't getting worse. Small victories. Kepler leaned against the console, panting as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. He half expected the universe to throw another curveball his way, because why not? But for now, the situation seemed to be under a modicum of control. He'd take what he could get. "Nice work," Loxley said, still holding his own against Thrace. "I knew there was a reason we kept you around." "Yeah, sure," Kepler replied, waving a hand dismissively. "Just don't expect me to become a full-time miracle worker." Thrace, for her part, seemed to realize that her window of opportunity was closing. Her people were flagging, worn down by the fight and the stubborn resilience of the monks. "You're not going to win this," she said, almost conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of a violent coup. "Maybe not," Loxley replied, his voice calm as ever. "But you're not going to take it either." There was a tense pause, the kind that stretched and twisted until it was almost unbearable. Kepler held his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to tip the balance one way or another. Finally, Thrace lowered her weapon, stepping back with a resigned sigh. "This isn't over, Locksley," she warned, eyes narrowing as she surveyed the room. "Never said it was," Locksley replied, lowering his own weapon in turn. "But it's over for now." Kepler released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders sagging with the weight of relief. It wasn't a victory, not really, but it was something. For a moment the room was quiet, the only sound the distant rumble of the storm outside. Kepler took a moment to appreciate the silence, the absence of conflict. Then he remembered the myriad tasks still demanding his attention and sighed. "Well, that was fun," he said, tucking his wrench back into his belt. "Let's not do it again anytime soon, yeah?" Locksley offered him a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes but was genuine nonetheless. "Agreed." Thrace and her people began to retreat, pulling back with a reluctance that suggested this wasn't the last they'd see of her. Kepler watched them go, a part of him wondering if there was some way to mend fences. Another part, however, the part that still remembered the chaos, was just glad they were leaving. "Do you think they'll be back?" Kepler asked, turning to Locksley. The monk nodded, expression thoughtful. "Undoubtedly, but we'll be ready." Kepler sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought moving to a quiet monastery would be relaxing, you know. Maybe learn how to meditate or something. But no, I had to pick the one with a target painted on it. Life rarely turns out the way we plan." "Yeah, I'm starting to notice that." With the immediate threat gone, Kepler turned his attention back to the tanks. The flickering lights suggested they weren't out of the woods yet, but at least they were on solid ground. He frowned, studying the machinery with a critical eye. "Think they'll hold?" he asked, gesturing to the tanks. "For now," Locksley replied, joining him. "But we'll need to make repairs." Kepler nodded, already mentally compiling a list of necessary parts and potential fixes. It was a daunting task, but he'd faced worse. Probably. Maybe. "Hey," he said, nudging Locksley with his elbow. "Thanks for not letting them kill me. I've got this thing about dying, you know." "Not really my style." Locksley chuckled, a low, warm sound that cut through the tension like a knife. "Anytime. Besides, who else would keep the place running?" It was a fair point, Kepler acknowledged. Maybe, just maybe, he'd stick around a little longer, assuming the universe didn't implode in the next couple of minutes. Always a possibility. "So," he said, surveying the wreckage with a critical eye. "Where do we start?" Locksley followed his gaze, considering the damaged machinery and the battered walls. "I suppose we start by cleaning up the mess." Kepler laughed, a short, sharp sound that was more genuine than he'd expected. "Sounds like a plan." And so, with the storm still raging outside and the faint hope of dawn on the horizon, they got to work. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And really, that was all that mattered. Kepler Vance eyed the control panel with the kind of casual disdain usually reserved for tax audits and mother-in-law visits. The flickering lights had stabilized, but the whole setup screamed temporary fix, louder than a politician promising change. Still, it was the best he'd managed under the circumstances, and considering the circumstances included a violent standoff and a storm that made hell look like a weekend getaway, he was pretty damn proud of himself. "Remind me again," he said, turning to Locksley, "why we don't just say screw it and blow this place to bits." Locksley, standing with the kind of serenity that only came from years of ignoring the universe's nonsense, gave a wry smile. "Because, Kepler, contrary to your nihilistic worldview, some of us believe in a future beyond the next 5 minutes. Is that what this is? Faith?" "I'd have pegged it as plain stubbornness," Kepler replied, jabbing a thumb toward the relics lining the monastery walls. "And speaking of stubbornness, I might have an idea." Locksley raised an eyebrow, which was monk speak for "go on, impress me, or at least don't embarrass yourself too much." "Right so," Kepler started, shifting his weight like a man about to con the pants off a used starship dealer. "Those relics. They've got to be good for more than just collecting dust and impressing tourists, right?" "Tourists," Locksley chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "As you can see, we're not exactly a hotspot." "Exactly my point." Kepler clapped his hands together. "No one's going to miss a few bits and bobs if they wind up, say, salvaged into the life support system." Just call it creative recycling. The monk's face remained impassive, but Kepler could see the wheels turning. You want to cannibalize sacred relics to fix the environmental controls. When you put it like that, it sounds sacrilegious, Kepler admitted. But it's either that or we all suffocate. I mean, we're not exactly spoiled for choice here, Loxley sighed, the kind of deep, world-weary exhalation that carried the weight of 1,000 sermons. Desperate times, I suppose. Kepler grinned, already rummaging through his mental toolkit for the most plausible-sounding justification. I like to think of it as honoring tradition by giving them a new purpose. Besides, if it works, we're heroes. If not, well, I doubt we'll be around to hear the complaints. Loxley just shook his head, the shadow of a smile still lingering. Let's hope your plan is as effective as your sarcasm, Kepler. No pressure, right? Kepler muttered, already moving toward the nearest cluster of relics. Now, let's see what we've got. The monastery's artifacts were a bizarre assortment of odds and ends that seemed to scream, I belong in a museum, louder than an overzealous archaeologist. But Kepler was less interested in their historical significance and more in their mechanical potential. Okay, let's see, he mumbled to himself, inspecting a particularly intricate contraption that looked like it had been pilfered from a steampunk fever dream. Cogs, gears. Hey, this could work. You sure about this? Loxley asked, glancing at the relic with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Of course not, Kepler scoffed. But hey, it's not like anyone's come up with a better idea. He set to work, dismantling the ornate piece with the finesse of a burglar at a high society gala. Time was of the essence, and Kepler had always been a fan of shortcuts. The relic's gears, surprisingly sturdy considering their age, might just do the trick. So, how's your day going? He called over his shoulder, fumbling with a particularly stubborn bolt. Loxley laughed, a rare sound that was more infectious than a space-borne pandemic. Oh, just another apocalypse. Ain't that the truth? Kepler muttered. You'd think they'd get old after a while. He pried loose a component that vaguely resembled a flux capacitor, though he had no idea if it would actually do anything useful. But beggars couldn't be choosers, and right now, Kepler was well past the begging stage. Mind giving me a hand? He asked, gesturing to the pile of parts he'd assembled. I could use an extra pair of hands, or two. Loxley joined him, rolling up the sleeves of his robe like a monk about to get down and dirty with some serious tech. Together, they began the painstaking process of retrofitting arcane technology into the monastery's failing systems. You ever done this before? Loxley inquired, passing Kepler a wrench. Depends on your definition of done this, Kepler replied, tightening a screw with perhaps too much enthusiasm. But I've always had a knack for making things work when they really shouldn't. That's reassuring, Loxley said, not sounding reassured at all. Hey, if it works, Kepler said with a shrug. And if not, well, we go out knowing we tried. The monk nodded, his expression somewhere between admiration and disbelief. Not quite the philosophy they teach here, but it'll do, Kepler snorted. Philosophy's overrated. Give me a wrench and a shot of adrenaline any day. The two of them worked in companionable silence, Kepler occasionally breaking it with muttered curses or, on rare occasions, an excited whoop when something clicked into place. The storm outside continued its furious onslaught, but they were too absorbed in their task to pay it much attention. Finally, with a flourish that would have made a magician proud, Kepler connected the last piece. Moment of truth, he said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. You ready for this? Not really, Loxley admitted. But let's do it anyway. With a nod, Kepler activated the system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the lights flickered back to life, the gentle hum of machinery filling the room. The air felt cooler, the oppressive humidity easing as the environmental controls kicked in. Holy hell, Kepler breathed, blinking in disbelief. It actually worked. Color me surprised, Loxley replied, a smile breaking through his calm demeanor. Looks like you've got a knack for miracles after all. Yeah, well, Kepler said, feigning modesty. I've always been full of surprises. The victory was a small one, but it felt monumental. In a universe determined to crush them underfoot, they'd managed to carve out a tiny sliver of hope. And really, that was more than they dared to expect. "You know," Kepler said, surveying their handiwork with something resembling pride. "I might just start believing in this whole teamwork thing." Loxley chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Stranger things have happened." The door slid open and Commander Drexler's voice boomed into the room, a jarring reminder of reality. "Vance, report." Kepler rolled his eyes, stepping away from the console. "Oh, just saved the day." "No big deal." Drexler's face appeared on the intercom screen, her expression one of skepticism mixed with grudging respect. "Really?" "Yeah, really," Kepler replied, crossing his arms. "Turns out we're not as useless as you thought." The commander regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Good work, keep it up." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Kepler shot back, though a small part of him felt a flicker of satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely doomed. As Drexler's image disappeared, Kepler turned to Loxley, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, we pulled it off. What now?" "Now," Loxley said, looking around at the battered remains of the room, "we figure out how to make this place livable again." "Sounds like a plan," Kepler replied, cracking his knuckles. "But first, a drink." "I've earned it," Loxley laughed, a sound that resonated with unexpected warmth. "I think we all have." As they made their way back toward the living quarters, Kepler allowed himself a moment of hope. The universe was still a mess, the odds still stacked against them, but they'd managed to snatch a victory from the jaws of defeat. And in a galaxy where everything seemed to be falling apart, that was no small feat. "Hey," Kepler said, nudging Loxley with his elbow. "Next time the universe tries to kill us, what do you say we tell it to bugger off?" "Agreed," Loxley replied, his smile widening. "Agreed." They continued down the corridor, leaving behind a trail of debris and the lingering echoes of laughter. The storm still raged, but inside there was a sense of calm, a rare respite from the chaos. And for the first time in a long time, Kepler felt a flicker of optimism. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it was there, nestled in the corners of his mind like a secret he barely dared to acknowledge. "Onward and upward," he said to himself, the words a mantra, a promise. And with that they stepped into the future, whatever it might hold, ready to face it head-on with courage, determination, and just a hint of irreverence. Because if there was one thing Kepler Vance had learned, it was that the universe might be relentless, but so were they. Kepler Vance slumped into a chair that looked like it had seen better centuries, his body protesting with every motion. "I don't know about you, but I'm getting real sick of saving the universe," he grumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. The room, or what remained of it after their makeshift engineering miracle, was buzzing with a sense of accomplishment. It was a rare thing these days, like finding a politician with a spine or a used spaceship dealer with integrity. Loxley, who had taken to this whole mechanical savior thing with alarming enthusiasm, chuckled as he inspected the relics they'd so unceremoniously gutted. "Just another day at the office, right?" "If this is an office," Kepler replied, "then I'm overdue for a promotion and a hell of a lot more vacation days." Before Loxley could reply, the intercom crackled to life with the dulcet tones of Commander Drexler. "Vance, you better not be taking a nap on my watch." Kepler rolled his eyes. "Relax, Drexler, just basking in the glow of not dying yet." Her voice was like a synthetic leather boot to the face, unforgiving but somehow comforting. "We've got movement on the perimeter. Thrace's crew is heading our way." "Of course they are," Kepler muttered, hauling himself out of the seat. Because who wouldn't want to join a party in a crumbling monastery filled with monks and malfunctioning clones? Loxley glanced at him, a question in his eyes. "You think they're here for the technology?" Kepler snorted. "They're here for the same reason everyone comes to a place like this: desperation. Thrace wouldn't come this far just to admire the architecture." He began to pace, his mind whirring with potential plans and pitfalls. "We need to figure out what they want, and fast. If Thrace is here, she's not just sightseeing." Loxley nodded, stroking his chin in thought. What do you propose? Negotiation, Kepler said with a grin that was all teeth and no warmth. And if that fails, we can always fall back on good old-fashioned threats. The monk shook his head, though his lips twitched with amusement. Your diplomacy skills are truly unmatched. That's what they tell me, Kepler said, shrugging into a jacket that had seen as much wear and tear as the rest of him. Now let's go welcome our guests. As they made their way to the main entrance, Kepler tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. He'd dealt with Sable Thrace before, and the woman was as ruthless as they came. If she wanted something, she'd stop at nothing to get it. The doors slid open with a reluctant creak, revealing Thrace and her entourage. They looked like they'd been plucked from the kind of dive bars that smelled of stale beer and bad decisions. Thrace herself was all business, her eyes sharp and calculating, like a hawk sizing up a particularly juicy rabbit. "What brings you to our humble abode?" Kepler asked, leaning against the doorway with the kind of casual bravado that screamed, "I'm not nervous, you're nervous." Thrace didn't bother with pleasantries. "Reports say you've got something going on here, cloning tech, a shot at humanity's future, or so they claim. Seems like a lot of trouble for a few glorified test tubes," Kepler replied, crossing his arms. "But hey, who am I to judge?" Her lips curved into a smile that was all predator. "We want in." "And if I say no," Kepler countered, keeping his tone light despite the tension thrumming in the air. Thrace shrugged, the motion as smooth as a well-oiled gun barrel. "Then we take it, but I'd prefer to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Makes things messy." Kepler exchanged a glance with Loxley. The monk's expression was unreadable, but there was a steely resolve in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "What do you think, old man?" Loxley sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Perhaps we can find some common ground." "A partnership of sorts." "A partnership?" Thrace echoed, arching an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Kepler hesitated, his mind racing. Trusting Thrace was about as wise as hugging a black hole, but they didn't have the luxury of options. "We share the tech. You help us stabilize the systems permanently. No more temporary patches." Thrace considered this, her gaze shifting between Kepler and Loxley. "And you trust us to keep our end of the bargain?" Kepler laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Trust is a strong word. Let's go with mutually beneficial skepticism." She chuckled, a low, throaty sound. "Fair enough. You've got yourself a deal for now." "Cheers," Kepler said, though the word tasted bitter on his tongue. Deals with the devil rarely ended well, but it was better than nothing. As Thrace's crew spread out, their presence filling the monastery with a new kind of energy, Kepler couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just invited the fox into the henhouse. He was about to voice this concern to Loxley when the alarm started blaring. "Fantastic," he muttered, rushing to the control panel. "What now?" The intercom buzzed with Drexler's voice, sharp and urgent. "Storm's picking up again. Systems are taking a hit. Can't catch a break, can we?" Kepler grumbled, fingers flying over the controls. "Loxley, get those relics ready. We might need another miracle." The monk nodded, already moving to gather the necessary components. "We can do this, Kepler." Kepler wished he shared Loxley's confidence. The universe seemed hell-bent on wiping them out, and they were running out of tricks. But giving up wasn't an option, not when survival was so tantalizingly close. Thrace approached, her expression unreadable. "Need a hand?" Kepler hesitated, then nodded. "Might as well. More hands, less dying." As they worked together, Kepler found himself grudgingly impressed by Thrace's efficiency. The woman was ruthless, but she knew her way around a crisis. Between the three of them, they managed to stabilize the systems long enough for the storm to pass. When the alarms finally fell silent, Kepler let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well, that was fun." Thrace smirked, brushing dust from her hands. "I do love a good challenge." "Yeah, well, next time let's try for less life-threatening challenges," Kepler replied, exhaustion tugging at his limbs. "Now what?" "Now," Thrace said, her gaze hardening. "We make this place worth the trouble." Kepler nodded, though a part of him wondered if they'd ever truly be free of trouble. The universe was a harsh, unforgiving place, and it seemed determined to remind them of that fact at every turn. But as he looked around at his unlikely allies and the battered but still standing monastery, Kepler couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. "Let's get to work," he said, rolling up his sleeves once more. "We've got a future to secure." And with that, they plunged back into the chaos, ready to face whatever challenges the universe threw their way. Because if there was one thing Kepler Vance had learned, it was that humans didn't back down easily. Not when there was so much at stake. Not when the future was theirs for the taking. Kepler Vance stared at the slowly flickering lights of the monastery ceiling, thinking how much they resembled his hopes and dreams, dim and barely holding on. The storm had finally settled into the sulkiest of drizzles, the kind that just couldn't be bothered making an effort. Around him, the monks and Thrace's merry band of ruffians were working together, which was a bit like watching a bunch of cats trying to play nice with a pack of dogs. But cooperation had its perks, and survival was one hell of a motivator. "Looks like you're stuck with us for a while," Thrace said, sidling up beside Kepler. Her eyes, usually as hard as a neutron star, had softened, if only slightly. "Hope you don't mind," Kepler snorted. "Oh, I mind all right, but since you're not planning to stab me in the back today, I'll let it slide," Thrace smirked. "It's a temporary truce, don't get too comfortable." "I've never been comfortable. Why start now?" Kepler replied, giving a tired shrug. "Besides, it's not like comfort's ever been an option with the universe plotting against us." He watched as the colonists and monks scurried about. The place was starting to look less like a crumbling relic and more like an actual, functioning base. Granted, it still had the charm of a rusted tin can, but it was their rusted tin can. Loxley approached, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that might have been cleaner if he just left them untouched. "We've made some progress," he announced, a hint of pride in his voice. "The environmental controls are holding steady and the cloning vats are stabilized." "Music to my ears," Kepler said, rubbing his temples. "I guess this means we won't be turned into human popsicles anytime soon." "Unless you have a sudden craving for cryogenics," Loxley replied, grinning. Thrace folded her arms, surveying the room. "I've got to admit this place might just work, but we're gonna need to keep our guard up. There's bound to be someone else sniffing around these parts soon enough." "You're right," Kepler agreed. "Desperation makes people do stupid things. Hell, it's why I'm here." "That's comforting," Thrace said dryly. "But I suppose we'll have to rely on our charming personalities and lethal weaponry to keep them at bay." Kepler nodded. "I'll work on the charm. You handle the weapons." "Deal," Thrace said, offering a hand which Kepler shook with only the slightest hesitation. As the day trudged onward, Kepler found himself wandering through the monastery, a patchwork of ancient stone and jury-rigged technology. Every corridor seemed to tell a tale of survival, both past and present. It was difficult not to feel a certain begrudging respect for the place. He paused by one of the cloning vats, watching as a newly formed clone blinked back at him. Its eyes were wide and uncomprehending, like a child seeing the world for the first time. Kepler smiled, a genuine one this time. "Welcome to the chaos, kid. Hope you packed a sense of humor." Loxley joined him, following his gaze. "Remarkable, isn't it? The promise of new life, even in the bleakest of times." "I suppose," Kepler said, crossing his arms. "But you ever wonder if we're just setting them up for disappointment? Bringing them into a universe that's more screwed than a cheap hooker on payday?" Loxley chuckled. "Perhaps, but we give them the means to survive. That's something." "Yeah, I guess hope's better than nothing." Kepler glanced at Loxley. "You ever think we might actually pull this off?" The monk considered this, his gaze thoughtful. "There's always a chance. The universe may be falling apart, but humans have a knack for enduring the unendurable." "Stubborn as a mule with an attitude problem," Kepler agreed, nodding. "Maybe that's our superpower." As the day drew to a close, the monastery felt more alive than it had in years. People milled about, chatting and joking, a motley crew bound together by necessity and a sense of purpose. Kepler observed it all with a mix of skepticism and reluctant optimism. Thrace approached, a drink in hand. Looks like we're making progress. Could be worse, Kepler replied, accepting the drink with a nod. We could be dead. Always the optimist, she teased, taking a sip. Comes with the territory, he said. Besides, if we manage to get through this mess, maybe the universe will cut us some slack. Or it'll throw us an even bigger catastrophe to deal with, Thrace said, ever the realist. Hey, I never said I was betting on a happy ending. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the makeshift community come together. It was strange to think that just a short time ago, they were on the brink of falling apart, and now. Well, they were still on the brink, but maybe with a slightly bigger margin. So what next? Thrace asked, glancing at Kepler. Same as always, Kepler said, feeling the weight of countless battles and narrow escapes pressing down on him. We keep fighting, we keep hoping, we keep surviving. Sounds like a plan, Thrace said, raising her glass. To survival. To survival, Kepler echoed, clinking his glass against hers. It wasn't much, but in a universe hell-bent on their destruction, maybe it was enough. Kepler wandered over to the makeshift control room, his eyes scanning the monitors, each one a window into a world of potential disasters. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. The universe was a cruel mistress, but he'd always been a sucker for a lost cause. Loxley joined him, his presence a steadying force. Thinking about what comes next, trying not to think at all, Kepler replied, leaning back in his chair. But yeah, I guess, we've got a lot of work ahead and not much time to do it. The storm's past for now, Loxley said. We should make the most of it. A break in the storm, Kepler mused. Funny how that feels more like a trap than a relief. Perhaps, the monk agreed. But we'll take what we can get, Kepler nodded, glancing at the readouts. At least the systems are stable for now. We owe you one, Loxley. The monk smiled, a serene expression that belied the chaos around them. We're all in this together, Kepler, and together we'll find a way. The sheer weight of expectation threatened to crush him, but Kepler pushed it aside. There'd be time enough for despair later, possibly over a stiff drink or three. For now, there was work to be done, and he'd be damned if he let the universe get the last laugh. As the night settled over the monastery, the stillness was a welcome change from the relentless storms. It was a fragile peace, but Kepler was determined to make the most of it. He wandered out to the courtyard, where a few brave souls had gathered around a fire, exchanging stories and laughter. Thrace was among them, her guarded demeanor slightly more relaxed in the flickering firelight. As Kepler joined the group, she gave him a nod of acknowledgement. Care to tell us a tale, Vance? One of Thrace's crew joked, raising an eyebrow. Kepler chuckled, shaking his head. My tales aren't exactly bedtime material, more like nightmares. Perfect, Thrace said. We could use a good scare. All right, Kepler relented, leaning forward. Once upon a time, a group of idiots thought they'd save the universe. Spoiler alert, it didn't go as planned. The group chuckled, and Kepler found himself smiling despite the heavy burden of reality. It wasn't much, but this small moment of camaraderie felt like a victory in its own right. And yet here we are, Thrace said, her voice quiet but firm. Still standing, still fighting. Yeah, Kepler agreed, his gaze on the flames. Funny how that works. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Kepler realized that maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at something more than mere survival. Perhaps in their struggle they'd stumbled upon something worth fighting for, a future that was their own to shape, no matter how uncertain. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in this universe of chaos and destruction, that counted for a hell of a lot. The monastery, once a forgotten relic in the vastness of space, was now a beacon, a fragile symbol of what could be achieved through sheer human stubbornness and a refusal to give up. And as Kepler looked around at his unlikely allies, he couldn't help but feel a strange, unexpected surge of hope. We're not done yet, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Not by a long shot, Thrace agreed, her gaze meeting his. They sat in silence, the fire casting shadows that danced on the walls, a testament to their resilience and determination. The universe might be relentless, but so were they. And that, Kepler decided, was more than enough.